If you wanted to keep people at the bottom of the pile, then the British educational system, it seems to me, is the perfect method of doing so.
In 2010, Eton sent more children to Oxford and Cambridge than the entire population of children on three school meals.
We have, in the last 15 years or so, doubled what we spend on education. We're now up to about 90 billion. There's a lot of money. So why is it that things have flatlined? Because they haven't got better. It's not about money, it's about ideas. And the ideas that are in the current education system are preventing real growth.
Schools with the highest level of poverty frequently run out of money the fastest because they're having to do more. But if they're not doing the right things, all the amount of money they spend on these children won't have any effect.
Between 1997 and 2010, per pupil spending in real terms doubled. In primary schools, it more than doubled. And yet we saw no improvement in the performance of the least well off.
The government can bring in innovations, impose them on a system, impose them on teachers, and before we know it, we've got innovations that are actually destructive of educational values, of improving educational opportunities.
I am Sophie Sander. This is Ayr, where I grew up, living with my mum and then my gran. This is the house I lived in with my mum. Living off state benefits, we were in the bottom quintile of UK household incomes. This is the chip shop where my mum was a waitress when I started secondary school. It's now a kebab shop. This is the school I went to. It remains one of the worst performing schools in Scotland, with some of the very poorest catchment areas. I always loved school, but I could tell something wasn't right. Not long in secondary school, I started to become aware that the poorest get the worst deal out of the schooling system in the UK. Ever since, I've been interested in why this is.
One of the big problems is the general culture in education of allowing children to make lots of excuses for themselves. So we laugh when we say, oh, the dog ate my homework, but it's the kind of thing that is allowed for children who come from difficult backgrounds. It must be because of what's happening at home. It must be because his father isn't there, etc. And the problem with doing that is that ultimately you really let the children down. And of course, that isn't going to serve them well in life. Because in life that won't happen. They'll just fire you from your job. And it's really important, I think, for schools to hold the line on these things.
So we frequently see schools in well-off areas experiencing low levels of misbehaviour and schools in poor areas with high levels of misbehaviour. What we frequently see in schools that haven't got behaviour right and in classrooms that haven't got behaviour right is teachers constantly putting out the same fires day in and day out for year after year after year, when in actual fact if they'd put in a bit more effort with the teachers at the start of their careers and perhaps a bit more support for those teachers at the start of those careers, then those teachers could have helped their students to learn habits which would last them a lifetime, or at least as long as they're in the school. So when it comes to classroom behaviour, prevention is absolutely better than cure, and it's far, far, far more cost effective.
There seems to be a culture of low aspiration as far as education is concerned. It's not merely low aspiration, it's actually an aspiration to do badly, that somehow someone is betraying. It's almost like informing in prison. If you do well at school, or try to do well at school. I remember one girl said to me that she wanted to study hard and she wanted to study French literature. And she was more or less persecuted by the other girls in particular, who said rather memorably that she was stupid because she was clever. Children who aspire to do well, who try to do well, seem to be persecuted. This is a very dismal attitude, but quite common. In fact, in the area in which I worked, almost universal.
People now seem to think the children will behave if their lessons are somehow planned to be as engaging as possible, which is a comforting illusion, but it's just not true. The disadvantaged are affected most by this, because when you've got children who come from homes which normally correlate to low levels of structure, low levels of social capital and so on, these are the children who need education the most. And when they get to school, they need the school to provide a safe, calm learning space where children can flourish and become the best that they can be. So these are the children that need structure most because they don't get a second chance. They don't get the safety net of private tutors and so on. They don't have someone going to give them a job immediately after school. So they have to get it right in school, which means that the school learning environment needs to be optimised to have the best behaviour as possible. And sadly, I think in too many schools that's just not happening.
One of the biggest reasons that poorer pupils have been let down for so many years by our public education system is what George W. Bush called the soft despotism of low expectations. A great example of this was provided by the Deputy General Secretary of the ATL, one of Britain's largest teaching unions, in 2007. So Martin Johnson gave an interview to The Guardian in which he was criticising what he called traditional education. So teaching children the best that had been thought and said, teaching them traditional subjects he thought was elitist. And he said that what children, particularly poor children, should be taught in schools were practical things. And when asked to give an example of what he had in mind, he suggested walking.
Well, a good way of thinking about what's wrong with the education system is to consider what would happen if food was supplied in the same way. So imagine that the government owned a whole lot of supermarkets and it supplied food free to consumers and paid for that food through taxation. Well, of course, everybody would go to the supermarket to get their free food. The government couldn't afford to supply them with the highest quality food in any quantity they want, so there'd have to be a kind of rationing. And people would inevitably be unhappy with what they got. And some of them, the rich ones, would be able to get around this by going to private suppliers of food who provide expensive, high-quality food. Now, that's exactly what you see in the education system. You get most of the population getting a kind of basic service from the state, and a rich minority getting a very high-quality, expensive service from private suppliers. The government has effectively crowded out the private sector from the low-cost provision of education. So the people who would normally be buying that instead just get given whatever the state chooses to give them. So they don't get a good service because they haven't got profit-seeking competing firms going after their voluntary business.
The government system of education doesn't necessarily stifle innovation. It might bring in innovations that are not required, that are not raising standards. We are very constrained in the private sector to think, will this really improve the outcomes for children? The state's system is not constrained like that. They can bring in almost whatever they want, whether it's working, whether it's worth anything or not.
Many people seem to have a moral objection to profit being made in the process of providing an education. And that's rather peculiar. Food's just as important as education, arguably more important. Does anybody think the supply of food would be better if people supplying it weren't seeking to make a profit out of that? The thing that's good about the profit motive is that it makes the supplier attend to the preferences of their customers.
It's almost like in the automobile industry in this country, we had a complete monopoly of manufacturers who just churned out Trabants, useless cars that barely worked, and when they did work, they invariably broke down. For years, the titans of this industry maintained that this was just the very best you could do, given the resources available to them. It wasn't possible to make better cars. It was just impossible, and anyone claiming otherwise was incredibly arrogant. They didn't know what they were talking about. It was just because they were inexperienced that they thought you could possibly make a better car than a Trabant. Policy is introduced, some competition is allowed, and within a few years you have some entrepreneurial, enterprising individuals using exactly the same resources as the Trabant manufacturers who come up with BMWs, Mercedes, Porsches, Audis. So of course the people who manufacture the Trabants aren't happy about that, and their response is not, well, maybe we should try and do a little bit better. Their response is, well, let's elect a government that can close down all these other factories so we can go back to just having everyone drive a Trabant.
It's worth reflecting that the state system in England and Wales, has only been here for 150 years. The system it replaced is worth recognising. Before the state got involved, there was a thriving private sector. The Newcastle Commission of 1861 showed that 95.5% of the school-aged population was in school for 6 years. They were in, as you can imagine, church schools, they were in philanthropic schools, they were in what we now call the public schools, those elite schools that were already there 150 years ago. But half of those children were in for-profit schools. And they were, in fact, the low-cost private schools that we see happening all across the world today. Reports kept saying parents are sending their children to these for-profit private schools, as they disparagingly called them, and we don't know why, because their buildings aren't as good as the other schools that are available from the church and so on. They seem to think that they're providing what they want. And what they're providing arithmetic. They're providing numeracy and literacy, as we call them today. And they're providing them skills that will be useful for them outside. So the first myth is that there wouldn't be a system. The second myth is that this system would not be really catering to what parents want, but it is a system that works for the benefit of all.
One of the great things about the free schools policy is that it didn't completely break the grip that the blob had on England's public education system, but it created a tiny crack which enabled lots of people from outside that world to set up some schools, to make a difference. The schools that people like me and others have managed to set up, for the most part, been extraordinarily successful. So if you measure the success of secondary schools, for instance, by the new Progress 8 measure, free schools last year topped the Progress 8 league table. That is to say, 11 to 16-year-olds made more progress relative to their starting points in free schools on average than at any other type of school in England. In the US, we now know what the most successful types of school are when it comes to raising standards, raising attainment for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's been a great deal of research, millions upon millions of dollars spent on discovering what is the most effective way of raising attainment in America's most disadvantaged communities, in some of its toughest cities. And the schools that work the best are what are known as no excuses urban charter schools. So charter schools are the US equivalent of free schools, and they've been going for much longer. In charter schools where there is a real emphasis on making sure the children behave properly, schools with extremely high expectations. The expectation is that every child at the school will go on to college, and the phrase no excuses doesn't just mean that there's no excuse for poor behaviour. It means there's no excuse for failure, no excuse for underachievement, no excuse for every child not getting into college. They are the schools in America with the highest standards, and they're often in places like Chicago, Detroit, tough parts of New York, and children at those schools from disadvantaged backgrounds do better, and considerably better, than they do at any other type of school. And one of the great things about the English free schools policy is it has enabled a group of people to essentially replicate the no excuses urban charter school model, but in some of the toughest cities, the most disadvantaged communities in England.
We try and do things differently. We have strict behaviour systems. That doesn't mean that it's an unkind place. In fact, it's very happy precisely because we have such great discipline. It means that teachers are free to develop their relationships with their kids and bring their own personalities into the classroom. It means that the corridors are wonderfully calm places where children can move quickly to their lessons and use every minute of their lesson to catch up with their privately educated peers. So that's behaviour. Then we also make sure that we're teaching from the front. Our teaching methods are more traditional, so we tell the children lots about what they need to know. That's not all we do. We then allow them to analyse it and discuss it and think about it. And when I say discuss, I don't mean in groups, because then they get off task, but we might do some quick pair work really structured and ordered pair work so that it gives them the chance to speak in an ordered environment which the teacher can then bring back. So our teaching methods are different, our behavior is different, and then also another big thing is the fact that we teach gratitude actively. People are happier if they're grateful, and so we actively get children to stand up at lunchtime and give appreciations to each other, to their teachers, to their parents, and so on. We do that to change them, to change their characters. We want them to be good people.
So a school called the London Academy of Excellence opened in Newham, 16 to 19, free school. It was a collaboration between a group of independent schools who thought that they could pour some of their expertise about how to get children into the very best universities, how to make sure they did really well in their A-levels, into a new free school in one of England's most deprived communities. That school, the London Academy of Excellence, has been unbelievably successful. So 2 years after it opened, its first cohort of graduates, I think more children in that cohort got into Russell Group universities than in all the other sixth forms in Newham combined. I mean, it was just staggeringly successful. What was the response of the neighbouring schools to this, essentially a complete humiliation of just how poorly they'd been doing, and a demonstration that it was nothing to do with the raw material, it was nothing to do with the fact that, you know, this was a really deprived borough. It was because expectations just weren't high enough at their school. So what did they do? Well, they actually combined together and set up a sixth form themselves, which is now doing incredibly well and is now a rival to the London Academy of Excellence. So there are now two fantastic schools in one of the most disadvantaged parts of the country that children can go to and secure the very best opportunities. And that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the free schools policy.
When we were first setting up, it was very difficult. It took us 3 years. We had a lot of detractors, a lot of people trying to stop us, people protesting constantly, shouting at me, calling me names. At a parents' evening where we had families coming along to find out about the school, and we had to hire a bouncer because we were worried about the potential violence. There were people who were bussed in from outside of London because they didn't have enough people who hated us in London, so they brought them in, and they all had placards, and they were calling me names, like shouting at me, and they had insults written on these placards. And then they infiltrated the event and placed themselves out so that when we were talking to the families, they would stand up and start shouting and disrupting. I could tell you about many events like that. It was really, really hard.
One of the difficulties my group faced when we first set about trying to set up a free school in this part of London, West London, immediately the local shop steward of the National Union of Teachers, then the most militant of the teaching unions, he tried to organise opposition as best he could. He tried to whip up opposition in all the local schools, amongst all the councillors and the council officers he had relationships with, and was really pretty effective at blocking our efforts to set up a school.
But we opened in the end, and we're now here, and I have seen a real change in things. So once upon a time, no one would listen to anything I was saying, whereas now people come to the school every day. You know, there are teachers from all over the country coming here every day. So it's a really positive thing. People are changing their minds because they're seeing what can be done. Before I was just making arguments. Now I'm actually doing it and showing, and there's an important difference. And people who were sitting on the fence before, they are coming round.
We are proving something very special. As we show this, I hope there'll be competitors coming into this market. I hope there will be others coming in, and slowly there will be a movement of lower cost private schools in this country. Imagine how that can liberate education from the dead hand of the state.
Teachers have low aspirations because, of course, they are always successful if their pupils meet their low aspirations. They can be satisfied that they've done all that they should and could do. If you have a system which tries to be universal, it will aim low universal.
We now know that there is a positive competition effect where free schools have opened.
take away the profit motive and it becomes a bit more like doing charity. And the interesting thing about charity work is that what happens is the preference of the supplier, the do-gooder.
Man is not just a billiard ball who's hit by other billiard balls and is obliged to go off in a certain direction. This attitude, I think, pervades our intellectual, cultural, social life. You see it in criminology, you see it in sociology and so on, and psychology. It all seems to me false, but not only false, more alarming, it's very destructive of the human personality and the possibility of human happiness.